Welcome back to the County Agent Podcast. This week we have Cassandra Olds. She's an assistant professor with the Department of Entomology at Kansas State University. Cassandra, how are you doing?
I'm doing good. It's beautiful outside. It's a Friday. I don't know when this will air, but for us right now, it's a Friday and we're doing great.
Yeah. Did you avoid the storms yesterday?
We did. I will say I'm a little bit more panicky than most. I'm clearly not from Kansas, right? So tornadoes are not something that I'm terribly comfortable with. So I tell you, the moment we get into the sort of the warning zone, that's it. All the cats are in kennels. We're hunkering down, but it passed over just fine.
Good. I was getting alerts on my phone, but I'm 3 hours away, so I'm just in the system. They send the alerts, and I thought, oh, wow. Yeah. So why don't we just start? Why don't you give a little introduction, who you are, where you come from, how you ended up at K-State?
Yeah. So I'm Cassandra Olds. I'm a livestock entomologist, and it's a very roundabout story. Sometimes they have us speak to graduate students and they're like, oh, well, how did you get here and what advice? And I say, I'm the worst one to talk to because this has all been luck of the draw, made up as we go along. I'm not trained as an entomologist. I'm actually a microbiologist by training, but really fascinated with animal disease. And then I started working on the diseases that are transmitted by ticks and insects. And just the more I worked on these things, the more I realized how important the insects or tick side of it is. And then just got fascinated by that. And one thing led to the other. And I'd actually been to Kansas before I interviewed here for the position I'm in now. And I loved K-State and I love Kansas. I was like, I'm not applying to anywhere else. This is where I want to go. And I'll just wait it out until they have a position for me. So that's how we landed up here and just have had a blast since.
Yeah. So the purpose of this podcast was we wanted to talk about Theileria, and to my knowledge, we haven't had any cases in Barber County yet. But as we've talked before, with the amount of stocker cattle that we run in this county and then in this area, the chances are there for it to come about. Can you kind of just talk us through what this is, where it comes from? The whole ball of wax.
The whole thing. So it is a protozoa. And so why this is important is that we don't have a vaccine and we don't have a treatment, right? No matter how many antibiotics you throw at this, it's not going to do anything. And so this is why it's as big of a problem as it is because we don't have good treatment options. And so it first was noticed on the East Coast in about 2017. Now, bearing in mind, it was there before then, but it's just when we started having our first outbreaks, right? And so it's transmitted by the Asian longhorn tick, and it has been framed largely as a tick-borne pathogen. But as we're learning more, there's these other ways, and so we need to stop thinking about it as just a tick-borne pathogen and we'll chat about relapses and stuff like that in a second, but the most effective way for this to get from animal to animal is through this Asian longhorn tick. And why this tick is so crazy, honestly, is that it doesn't need to find a mate to reproduce. So every other tick, you've got to have a male tick and a female tick finding each other on the same animal at the same time, and your odds are really low. So even though we have some fluctuation in tick populations year to year, it's relatively stable, all things considered. The Asian longhorn tick, everybody's a female. And so within a very short period of time, you can get this kind of hyperinfestation. And we really run into problems when we've got a hyperinfestation of the tick. Then we have the pathogen there, and then cattle that are naive, meaning that they've never had experience or exposure to Theileria before, get a dose that's too high for their immune response to manage. And that's when we see disease. Now, interestingly, when we look at herds, when we look at a typical outbreak herd, a tick outbreak transmission herd, you can look at other herds in the surrounding area, and they're 90 to 100% infected, but there's no disease because cattle got a low enough exposure to it that their immune response could take care of it. And so what we actually have is a whole lot of herds that are positive but we don't know because nobody had disease. And so we don't spend money testing things that look perfectly healthy. And so there's that initial infection that can be caused by a tick, but it can also be transmitted by sucking lice. It can be transmitted by needles. And coming out of my lab last summer, we've got pretty good evidence that stable flies and other biting flies can also transmit it. So this is something to keep in mind, right? You may never have the tick and you can still have a Theileria problem. And especially for areas where we do bring in a lot of stockers, where we do bring in a lot of out-of-state cattle, especially if those are coming from the east, where it's 90 to 100% infection rate, chances are it's already circulating in your area. It's just nobody's quite had a wreck bad enough that they've bothered to test. And so a lot of times, in at least in the cow herd situation, people say, oh, I thought I was dealing with anaplasmosis, but it wasn't responding to treatment. It was looking a little bit strange. We then lost some animals and we tested and they were Theileria. Now, Theileria infection with anaplasmosis does occur. And what is that interaction? We still don't know. And so that's the one part of it, right? Is we can have the natural transmission from animal to animal to animal. What we're also, and having outbreaks, what we're also seeing is that, especially in our feed yards and our stockers, that we can have animals that were maybe infected somewhere else arriving into the state. And then shortly after arrival, you'll get sort of a large number of the animals in the load, or, the lot, all of a sudden come down with Theileria disease. And that is because the stress of the movement has resulted in an immune response, which is then compromised. And then the Theileria is just like, hey, if you can't keep a lid on this pot, we're going to boil over. And so it's just the parasite making use of a good environment for it. Now, those animals were quite happy and healthy where they were, but just that stress. And so we really need to be thinking about this in terms of where are we getting our animals from? And not that we need to be avoiding buying cattle from anywhere, right? Because as this moves around the country, everybody's going to have it eventually. So there's eventually going to be no source of clean cattle, Theileria clean cattle, right? So everybody's going to probably get it, especially if flies can transmit it. So it's thinking about when we're buying cattle in, and also as we're selling cattle, the saying goes both ways. How do we make sure that those animals are as healthy as possible when they leave where they're at? And then when they get to their new destination, how do we keep them low stress? How do we keep them nutritionally, best options available? Fresh, clean water. How do we keep them nice and comfortable, right? Just weather itself. If you've got a bad weather event and all of a sudden they're coming in and they're getting wet and cold and dry, and it's that sort of a situation. Did they already have sort of respiratory issues? All these things start to play a role. And so I think we need to start thinking about making sure that when cattle leave us, they're in the best health possible, where we're getting our cattle from, and making sure that whoever's selling you these animals is making sure that they're healthy. And then how do you make that transition for them as low stress as possible? And then if we start thinking about it that way, then I think we can start having these fewer wrecks, and we will always have Theileria. We're not getting rid of it, but how do we manage it so we don't have disease?
So what are, if somebody's not familiar with it, what are some of the symptoms that they should be looking for?
And so this is something that, it's so important. Everything we know, everything I know right now sitting here, doesn't come from a textbook, doesn't come from a scientific paper, doesn't come from a fact sheet. It comes from people talking to me. And so when people have wrecks, to call us and talk to us about it, because we've now been able to say, okay, this looks different for the United States. This looks different in our mature animals over a year old versus younger animals. Without that, we would have been lost, right? So what we've gathered from people talking to us and from what we've responded to enough of these wrecks to sort of put together a picture It's going to look different depending on whether the animal is, a year and older versus a year and younger. In our older animals, it's going to look like anaplasmosis that doesn't respond to treatment. So we do get the anemia, but that's later on. One of the first things, and this is just a general Theileria thing that we notice across all Theilerias, the first thing that happens is the animals go off feed. They don't want to eat. And this is why keeping an eye on animals, especially after stress events, is so important, because if you can get them back onto food as soon as possible, there's a much higher chance we can pull them through. So going off food is one of our key indicators that something's not right. The other thing is that they're very, very lethargic and exercise intolerant. We've had horrible stories about them trying to get it into the chute to bleed it, and it just drops dead, right? And the animal's not wanting to get up and move. They just want to lay there. They just feel miserable. So anytime you've got an animal who's lethargic, exercise intolerant, just looks just depressed, they can also sometimes, when they're standing there, they might stand with their head hanging low. You can get a little bit of coughing, fever responses there. Later on in the disease, we start to see the anemia, but don't use anemia as your canary, because, but by the time you see anemia, the animal is pretty far gone. And so if we can catch them really, really early on. Now, in our younger animals, it's going to look like a pneumonia that doesn't respond to treatment. So we get a lot of snotty noses, some sort of rapid respiratory rates, shallow breathing. But again, they don't want to eat. They're very, very lethargic, and they just look punky. Again, we'll see the anemia, but it's sort of later on in the disease course. And because we don't have a vaccine, we don't have a drug treatment available yet. Really, what is going to get animals through this is symptomatic care. And this is why I say to people, it's so important that you have a good relationship with your veterinarian, right? Because the veterinarian can come out and can give you drugs that are going to help with the secondary infections, that are going to give you drugs that are going to help the animal be more comfortable, that may get them up and moving and eating and drinking. And it can go so quickly. This isn't a case where, you want to get the next available appointment. You want to know that you have a great relationship with your vet, so that he's like, yeah, I'll be right out. Right. Because that's the most important part is having that supportive care to try and get the animals through it.
So of the cases we've seen in Kansas, are those as a result of a death, or do we have some that we're actually to measure saying they've got it, but they're okay?
Yeah, we do. Not everybody who gets it dies, right? And so sometimes we'll have people send in some samples that the animal's really, really sick. And so just because an animal's positive doesn't mean it's going to die. We, at least, people who send samples into the diagnostic lab, and I'm not affiliated with the diagnostic lab, but just, having spoken to people who have sent them samples, that you're not sending a sample in unless an animal's pretty sick. And so what probably is happening is we've got a slightly skewed perception of it, in that we only send samples in when animals are sick, and usually when they're that sick, they're close to being dead anyway. We also only call in the veterinarian when it's like, this is way worse than we thought. And so many, I would say more often than not, it's coming in and it's just fine. And so for me, so we responded to the outbreak that happened in Iowa. And that was really, really interesting, because what happened was they put naive cattle onto a pasture that they didn't know was infested with Asian longhorn tick. And yeah, they had a 20% mortality rate, right? Within a couple of weeks, lost 20 animals just like that, right? When we went and we looked at the pastures surrounding and in that area, we looked for the ticks, and we looked for, we sampled all the cattle. And 7 out of the 8 herds, the one herd had the outbreak, but the other 7 herds had no clinical disease. But 88 to 100% of those animals were infected. Now, nobody would have tested those animals had we had not had that outbreak. And now, so if and so now, like veterinarians, and if we hadn't have looked, we would have assumed that that's all Theileria is. Same way when we bring in stockers. We worked with somebody and they had a horrible wreck one year. Again, over 20% mortality rate. The animals came in fine, but we had bad weather. The next year we looked at, and I discussed it with him, and he was like, well, do I want to get cattle from the same place? And I said, look, you got cattle from there the year before and they were fine and they were probably infected. So we decided, okay, fine, we'll get them in. And I said, and he had no issues. You know, we had a 20% mortality the year before, no issues this year, but they came and they arrived in good weather. And when I tested that, same infection rate. So an animal being infected doesn't necessarily mean anything. It really is up to, and this is the infuriating part, is it's hit and miss, right? We can't predict whether an animal is going to get clinical disease or not. And so it really is about just maintaining the relationships that you have with suppliers that you know have been there for you for years and years and years, and then saying, okay, when we receive them, how do we make sure that this receiving goes well?
So as of right now, this isn't something we see in sheep, goats, horses. It's exclusive to cattle.
Yep. And so there's potential that it can. So there's it may be able to infect other ungulates, you know, but it doesn't replicate and cause pathology. So they're considered, even if in the, you know, because as scientists, we don't like to say this never happens, right? Because the moment you say something never happens, lo and behold, it happens, right? But we don't necessarily, even if, for example, a white-tailed deer can get infected, they don't get overt disease and they clear it before it can get picked up by a tick. So we really, and that's for us is a godsend, because we only have to worry about our cattle population, right? There's no wildlife reservoir that we necessarily have to worry about. It has been understudied in bison. We because it will infect, you know, all the bovids, you know, the cattle, water buffalo, yaks, things like that. We can assume that it probably can infect our bison. Their ability to tolerate it, we don't really know. But we haven't had reports of sort of mass die-offs in bison. So if they do have it, we haven't had any clinical disease yet.
Yeah, and as you mentioned earlier, there's probably a lot of cattle that have it that just haven't shown signs or anything. So we can assume that it wouldn't cause a food safety issue. And
again, we're like zero food safety issues, right? Honestly, you could purify out Theileria parva and you could eat it. You could smear it on your skin. You could put it directly into your blood. You could do anything you wanted and you would be just fine, right? This is not something that we have to worry about in terms of a human pathogen issue. Now, the tick, Asian longhorn tick, we don't need to be bitten by those, right? There's anything that the Asian longhorn can transmit, our native tick species transmit anyway. So it's not like we have to worry about new tick pathogens. But we you know, anytime that we do get ticks on us as humans or pets or things, let's just get them off as fast as possible. Nobody needs ticks biting them for any way, shape, or form.
Yeah. So this isn't, this may be new to us in Kansas and possibly the United States, are relatively new, but it's not new in other parts of the world. Can you talk about what other countries have done with this through the years?
So it's largely been understudied. So I was, you know, you've got kind of like this is not the only Theileria species. There's multiple Theileria species. And you know, in my mind, I have a list of sort of the worst to the best. And there's way worse Theilerias out there, right? There's two big ones that are way more pathogenic. I mean, Theileria parva, which occurs in Africa, if you're looking in your sort of your European breeds, that's a 90% mortality rate right there, right? So there are other Theilerias out there, and in areas where we have the bad ones and Theileria orientalis is also there, it's almost a non-issue, right? Because if you've got something way worse, who cares if you've got Theileria orientalis? So Theileria parva is killing off 90% of your herd, right? You're focusing your energy on that. So it's been understudied. It went. It's originally from sort of the Asian area, Japan area, and a large number of those Asian countries have it. It went into Australia and New Zealand fairly recently, but it's, if you look at Australia specifically, because New Zealand's fairly unique, but Australia has a large beef industry, right? But Australia has a whole lot of ticks and a whole lot of pathogens, and they have the nasty ones, right? They have really, really nasty ones. Kind of like, I'm from South Africa, and we have the whole lot of them. We've got the anaplasmas, the babesias, the ehrlichias. We got all of them. And so in those systems where you have really extreme climate conditions, right? And you don't have Flint Hills prairies, right? You've got poor quality forage, you've got extremely hot weather, you've got a whole lot of ectoparasites. To make that system work, they shifted to breeds that can excel under those conditions. Those breeds tend to be tough as nails as it is. So their ability to tolerate Theileria, if Babesia didn't take them out, Theileria orientalis isn't taking them out. And so they got it in, and it became stable, and it became somewhat of a non-issue. And so it's there, it's circulating. And one of the things, the problem with science is that we tend to only spend money on the things that are problems, right? And so we should have been thinking ahead and thinking, hang on, this is probably going to come to us. Hang on, our production system is very, very different. And part of the reason why it's taken us so long is that when we would read the papers and the studies that came out of Australia and New Zealand, they're like, 2 to 5% mortality rate. Okay, but why is this different? Why are we seeing differences? And so we can't use a lot of what the information we have from Australia, because it's just so different. So now it's coming here. We have to build our own profile of what does this look like for us, and it's going to vary state by state, right? Kansas brings in more stockers than any other state, I think, right? Like this is one of the things we do, and we're great at it. But that also means that this is always going to be a problem for us, because we're never going to get it out of the cow herd, which means we're always going to have infected positive animals coming in. And so we need to figure out what this means for Kansas, what this looks like for Kansas. And then, okay, how do we manage this so that we suffer as few losses as possible? And part of that is, making sure that people talk to your congressman and your stuff like that, and follow those numbers that they tell you to call if you have a question, right? The more people we can say, hey, we're concerned about this, we want research answering our questions, not academic questions, right? Because there's the academic side of it that can get way down into the weeds and figure out which protein is interacting with which protein to do this, to that. No, we need some real common sense solutions to how do we manage this. And then that will start, squeaky wheels get the grease. And then hopefully we'll start to get some freeing up of money, so that they say that, hey, this is something that we need to address. And then we can start working on things like vaccines and treatment options and things like that, and figuring out, because there's always causation and correlation. What is a cause and what is a correlation? And really, because sometimes I'll speak to people and they'll be like, oh, well, I had a wreck, and then the following year I vaccinated with this completely unrelated thing and I had no wreck, so now I'm going to be doing this. Probably unrelated, but who knows? Who knows, right? Until we do the studies, who knows?
So in regards to the Asian longhorn tick, is there a certain environment that it thrives in more than others?
Yeah, it really likes high humidity. And so they did a kind of a climate model prediction map. And this work actually came out of K-State, where they kind of looked at where it occurs in the rest of the world and modeled the US climate on it. And it really is sort of like East Coast and West Coast, with everything in the middle being less favorable. So probably the eastern third of Kansas is potentially a habitat. less so as we move westward, it gets too dry. Now, that being said, this is not a no tick, no problem situation, right? Because anytime we move cattle, and if the flies are transmitting it, then everybody's got to be on the lookout for it. But in terms of our ticks, I think one of our saving graces, at least in sort of Flint Hills area, is that we do burn, right? And so burning is one of the most effective ways to eradicate a tick population. Now, you only get cover for the next growing season, right? So if you burn in the spring, you've only got, if I burnt in, early this year, I've only got coverage for this grazing season. That doesn't extend into to next year. But I think that is one thing that I'm glad we have as an option. Other places where you get these hyper infestations, they have really limited options, right? We can at least burn that pasture and really knock it down. One of the things that we need to, this tick likes to be in shrubby areas. And so getting rid of those eastern red cedars is going to be absolutely critical. Eastern red cedars are tick hotspots. And so let's make life as difficult for the tick as possible, right? We don't need to give it any easy free meals. And so paying attention to trees and shrubby areas and just really paying attention to take a walk through the pasture. Do you see a lot of, and this is a nondescript tick, it doesn't have any markings on it, it's going to be a brown tick. But if you see sort of really, really high numbers of ticks, and I'm talking about hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of ticks, that's not normal, right? That's not that's a whole lot of ticks. Let me get in my truck and just not think about this. Give me a call, right? That's a sign that we've got a hyper infestation, because we want to be very, very careful that if that is the case, that we don't put cattle onto that pasture without knowing their infection status. Because if we put naive cattle onto a hyper-infested pasture, surefire, we're going to have an outbreak.
So how much, you'd mentioned that you are seeing some cases that transmission could come through lice and stable flies. How much is that has that been looked at? Because that, to me, seems to be more of a concern where we're at in Barber County and going west than the Asian longhorn tick.
Yes, and so it's super fresh, right? We're this year, what we're going to do is, so last year we found the pathogen in the fly mouthparts, and we had evidence of within herd transmission. No disease, but transmission. We had a whole lot of positive animals that should not have been positive, considering that there were no ticks, and we made sure that there were no ticks. So, and this has happened in multiple places, so it's not just a once-off. And so we've got this strong suspicion that this is happening. This year, what we're going to do is actually bleed cattle as they go on to pasture, and then bleed them at the end, and then do tick drags throughout the whole season. Because if we can convincingly show that there's no tick, but we see a change in the number infected, chances are it is transmitted. We did put in a grant to get it funded to do proper, physically taking stable flies, but we're waiting to see. So I think that it's safe to, so we don't tend to see disease outbreaks when we have transmission by stable flies and lice, because the dose that they give is low. And so they're not very good at being vectors, but they have a whole lot of them, and so they can overcome that. But so we don't see clinical disease outbreaks for the most part, right? That's not to say it's never going to happen. So I always say that and it varies, right? If you have a cow herd, it's worth knowing what your herd status is, even if you don't have infected cattle, if you don't have clinical disease, right? Just know what you've got. Because if we're bringing in stockers and they're fence to fence, a fly can fly, right? So we need to start thinking about, my herd may be clean, but what's happening around me? So just knowing what your herd status is. And then the most important thing is, just keeping a closer eye on cattle than we're maybe used to. Catch these things before they go bad. And really, as long as the animals are healthy, good nutritional state, and low stress, they should be fine.
Any other precautions that producers could could take to lessen the chance, besides just a good clean environment, good nutrition?
Good clean environment, a single-use needle policy is not a bad idea, right? It becomes somewhat of a moot point if we prove that flies are doing it, because you can change your needles, but if a fly is but it's always dose dependent. So, if a fly is already going to do it, then let's not add a needle challenge on top of that, right? So just a single needle use policy is probably a good idea for many, many reasons, and including Theileria. And just keeping up to date. And it's infuriating because we don't have a lot of options that we can do. But one thing that I do think is important is for people to keep listening to podcasts like yours, keep listening to see, because things have changed. Last year, this time, we didn't know that we could detect Theileria in sable flies, and it was only a tick-borne pathogen. And all our messaging and our materials and everything have focused it on it being a tick-borne pathogen. In the space of a year, we've had a big change. Now, last year, this time, we were only starting to see it in stockers. We hadn't seen it really in feed yards yet, right? So keeping up to date with what's going on, so that if changes do happen, people know about it, because forewarned is forearmed. And so just, listen to the podcast when you're driving, for an hour between sites or whatever. Just listen to podcasts, keep up to date with what's going on.
Yeah. Is there anything else you want to share with producers before we end this interview?
Yeah, just that feel free to, Case, I have an extension appointment. K-State pays for me to be of service to the people of Kansas. So they don't have to feel like they can't give me a call. I have an extension number, and I take it home on the evening and home on the weekends. And I've had producers often call me on the weekend, and they're like, "Oh, I wasn't expecting you to pick up," But Theileria doesn't keep a 9 to 5, and so you shouldn't have to feel like you're alone in this. And so my number is 78. What is my number? 785-706-8599. I think that's my number. Double check that.
We can put it in the podcast
put him in the show notes. Yeah. I have my personal number, and I have my work number, and they're similar enough that sometimes I shuffle them together and I come up with a whole new number. But put it in the notes. People can also feel free to shoot me an email, and just, if you see something, give me a call, right? Because where we've run into problems is where people saw something, didn't know who they could call, and then it went too far. So just reach out.
Okay. Well, I appreciate your time on a Friday afternoon.
Yeah.
And hopefully we have some people learn a little bit more about this, and stay diligent and stay proactive.
Yeah. And I would say we want to be vigilant, but not panic. Right.
Yeah.
The one thing that before you mentioned anything, was there anything else? There is one other thing that I want to tell people. Everybody's super scared of this tick. And what people do when they're super scared of the tick, the first thing that they do is they reach for the sort of injectable ivermectins, and they inject their cattle, and they'll just inject the whole herd just in case. Now, the problem is that ticks are not very well controlled by ivermectins. That's problem number one. And problem number two is that once you inject a product into an animal, you can't take it out. And so as it gets metabolized, that concentration decreases. And then all your horn flies that are feeding on this animal, all your stable flies that are feeding on this animal, they start feeding on an animal at sublethal concentrations. And it's going to drive insecticide resistance in our gastrointestinal nematodes, and it's going to drive insecticide resistance in our horn flies and our stable flies, who are going to cost us way more money year after year after year than Theileria ever will. Right? So don't panic. This is a situation that we can take care of. Don't be reaching for the long ranges and the Ivomix and just giving everybody a shot so that you feel better about the situation. You'll cause more harm than good. If you do have a tick infestation, give me a call. We'll figure it out.
You bet. Good information right there. I appreciate you adding that in.
Yeah.
So we'll go ahead and wrap this up. Thanks again for coming on, and have a great weekend.
You too. Bye-bye.